We are Students for Justice in Palestine, and tonight we will be hosting our guest speaker, David Sheen. David Sheen is an independent journalist and filmmaker originally from Toronto, Canada, who now lives in Dimona, Israel. For the past 5 years, Sheen has been reporting from inside of Israel on the frightening levels of anti-Palestinian, anti-African, and anti-Gentile racism that pervade Israeli society and form government policy and incite vigilante attacks. Oops. So if you would all help me welcome our speaker, David Sheen.
Thanks so much for coming out here tonight. I really appreciate that you care enough about me and the people that I live with and the place that I live, that you would come out to hear what's happening on the other side of the world. I'm going to speak about the bullet, the ballot, and the boycott. Generally, when I come out with this slide, people assume that I'm going to be speaking about boycotting Israel. But in fact, I'm not going to be speaking about boycotting Israel. I'm going to be speaking about Israel boycotting. Because I contend that the state of Israel and sadly increasing amounts of Israeli society are actually boycotting Israel's non-Jewish citizens, specifically indigenous Palestinians. So let's go to the Oxford English Dictionary a moment. What's a boycott? A boycott is a withdrawal from social or commercial interaction or cooperation with a group. Now, let's look at this idea of what Israel is in the popular imagination. We think of the kibbutz, these socialist collectives that dot the country, and people, a back to the land movement, and people living together in community, and all for one and one for all. And it was those things, and still is in some places, but it was not socialism, but socialism for Jews. And when non-Jews asked to join these socialist collectives, these kibbutzim, they were refused. They were told, no, you cannot join because you're not Jewish. We're talking kibbutzim. Let's move on to villages. So because the Israeli government boycotts Arab towns and villages, does not give the same kind of funding as it does to Jewish towns and villages, so many of these villages simply are unable to expand, are unable to build new neighborhoods, are unable to create the infrastructure for their communities to grow. So this family of Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Ka'adan family, they figured, okay, well, there's nowhere to build a house in our village, but the next town over, there's no reason, we live in a democracy, right? Israel's a democracy, right? So there's no reason why I can't buy a house in the next village over. And so they attempt to do so, but they are told in no uncertain terms, no, you cannot buy a house in our village because you're not Jewish. And so they take it to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, the landowner has to give an accounting and explain why they refuse to sell the land to this family, to the Ka'adan family. And the land, much of the land in Israel, most of it is overwhelmingly owned by either the state or a quasi-governmental organization, the Jewish National Fund. So the Jewish National Fund, Jewish people may be more familiar with it as, this fund that we bought into, that we were always asked to spend our hard-earned dollars and contribute to this collective fund that bought up land in Israel. And now this is what's happening with that land in Israel. So the JNF has to tell the Supreme Court why they refuse. And what they tell them is, the JNF is not a public body that works for the benefit of all citizens for the state. They say the loyalty of the JNF is given to the Jewish people, and only to them is the JNF obligated. The JNF does not have a duty to practice equality towards all citizens of the state. So kibbutzim, villages, towns. I should mention actually that the Supreme Court, in the end, they did find with the Ka'adan family, and they were allowed to purchase the land and build their house. But as often happens with a Supreme Court ruling, the government just figured out a way to sidestep it, create a legal loophole. They actually passed a new law that they termed the Ka'adan loophole law. And with this new law, they essentially allow hundreds of towns and villages across the country to boycott non-Jewish citizens, but not only. It could be also Jewish people of color, it could be queer people. It's anyone who they don't want in their communities, and all they have to say is you don't fit the cultural makeup, and you don't have to give any any explanation or justify these decisions. So in this way, the Supreme Court just papers over, just, launders the racist practice of boycotting Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now, move to cities, like we've got towns and cities like, for example, Upper Nazareth, and this is the mayor of Upper Nazareth, Shimon Gafsu. Now, like the rest of the state of Israel, the town of Upper Nazareth is about 25% Arab, or Palestinian citizens of Israel, the rest Jewish citizens of Israel. And he refuses to allow the building or the opening of an Arabic language school. Of course, the Palestinian people who live there want their children to learn their mother tongue, want them to grow up and learn their own language. But he refuses to allow Arabic school to be established in the town of Upper Nazareth, and he justifies his opinion in an op-ed piece in Haaretz. He writes, "Upper Nazareth is a Jewish city and a proud offshoot of a glorious dynasty of racists," he writes. When it comes time for his re-election, he actually campaigns on this basis. He's hoping other racists like him will vote for him, and so he puts on his campaign poster, "No more sticking to the law that allows any citizen to live wherever they want to." There's no real shame around this, right? You're actually hoping that you'll gain votes from this, if you can imagine that. So we've talked about kibbutzim and villages and towns and cities and developments. We're talking about new developments too. So let's say we've got Givat Oranim. You see this advertisement, and you look at these photographs and these renderings, and they look attractive, and you also want to buy a house there. That looks nice. And so you call them up. You call up the company, and you say, "I'm interested in setting up an appointment to come see one of these apartments." And they say, well, once they hear your Arabic accent, or they hear that your name is Ahmed, or they ask what village you're from, and they understand from that you're a Palestinian citizen, then they say, "אבל אנחנו לא מוכרים לערבים, okay? But we do not sell to Arabs, okay?" And this is people's, again, this isn't some kind of outlier, all right? It's not that the company does this and then it's raked over the coals and has to pay some kind of fine. You see the developers here posing with the very minister of housing until recently, Uri Ariel, although it shouldn't be so surprising that he does that, since Uri Ariel has gone on record as saying, "We must encourage Arabs to willingly leave, both from the cities and from the state." So this is how, in the state of Israel, non-Jewish people are boycotted for housing. Now let's talk about the labor market. And when you walk around in Israel, it's not uncommon to see signs like this, and I'll translate it for your benefit. Jewish workers, plaster paint. I mean, it's clear that we're not talking about some task that only Jewish people can perform. They're not looking for a Torah scroll writer, calligrapher. They're asking for someone who can do any old job, and there's no reason why you'd need a Jew to do it specifically, unless you're a racist and you only want to give money to Jewish people and to no one else. And so these kinds of advertisements, which are not uncommon in Israel, it plays on that. And it's hoping that you will you'll find a place to spend your racist dollars with them. You can open up the Yellow Pages until recently, and you will find this coded language throughout. Avodah Ivrit, and again I've translated Jewish labor. This is like a code phrase to mean we only hire Jews, so if you spend your money with our place of business, you can be sure all of your money will only go to Jewish people. Of course, we're in the internet era now, so we now have websites that catalog all these businesses, Jewish labor. But we also have citizens' initiatives on the streets. So this is the Machane Yehuda market in downtown Jerusalem, for those who are familiar. The largest market, certainly in West Jerusalem, maybe in all of Jerusalem, and hustling and bustling, really active market. And so you have someone actually going from stall to stall and from store to store and asking store owners, "Excuse me, are there any Arabs working here? Are there any Africans working here? No, just Jews? Just, okay." Marking over to the next store. And in this way, they create a map of the entire market. Which stores only Jews work at, which stores Jews and non-Jews work at. And in this way, this is supposed to help racist people who only want their money to go towards Jews, to boycott non-Jews. Like I said, there's all kinds of initiatives like this, including from this young man who wrote on his Facebook page, "The Arab sons of bitches, it's our duty to boycott every Arab business or product. I boycotted those shits even before. Nothing out of the ordinary about his boycott specifically, except that, as Simone documented, this happens to be the son of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. So we've talked about housing, we've talked about labor market, and we're going to talk about recreation. So as I said, Arab towns and villages don't receive the same kinds of funding as Jewish towns and villages do, and so they often lack basic amenities. It's the Middle East, it's hot. It's the summer and you want to take your kids to the public pool, but none exist in your town because you don't have that kind of funding in order to build one. But it's a small country, and so it's no big thing to just drive 10 minutes or 15 minutes to the next village over, and now you're in a Jewish village that has public pools. And so you want to take your sons and daughters there, and you call them up, and they tell you, as soon as they hear your accent, as soon as they hear your name, and they know that you're Arab, and they say, I'm sorry, we don't allow people from other villages to swim in our pool. Only people from our own village can swim in our pool. And you call up village after village and pool after pool, and you get the same response every time. Of course, if a Jewish colleague calls them up, and of course they're like, of course, no problem, come on down. But, you know, admittedly, at least one of these pools did permit Palestinian citizens of Israel to swim there, but then they charged them double the price. So, same thing when it comes to, I guess, the Israeli version of Six Flags, an amusement park. Palestinian family wants to take their kids there on the big. You worked hard all week. Comes the end of the week, you want to take your kids out. You get them in the car, you drive them out there, and you get to the gate, and you're told, "No, I'm sorry, you can't come in. It's Jews only today. You're a Palestinian person, and so therefore, you're going to have to go home. But maybe you can come back later on in the week. We'll have Palestinian Day, and then we can allow you on a separate day to entertain your children." So we're talking about housing, we're talking about labor, we're talking about recreation, and we see that Israel also boycotts non-Jewish people, Palestinian people, in terms of their political representation. So this is a photograph from the newspaper, a leading Israeli newspaper. Just a few months ago, we had national elections, and I know y'all here are accustomed to the two-party system. In Israel, there's dozens of parties that run the election, and in the parliament, in the Knesset, you will see, upwards of 10 political parties represented. So when it comes down to having a televised debate, it's actually a full room, and so this is the photograph that the newspaper ran the day after one of these head-to-head debates, except the photo that they ran was not the full photograph. So they just totally cut out Ayman Odeh, the head of the Joint List Party, because he is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and his party is the party of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so they just lopped him off, they cropped him out, because, it's not even legitimate to vote for him. He's not like an actual politician. They don't even see him as being legitimate. So let's run through the gamut. So-called centrist, head of the centrist Yesh Atid party, Yair Lapid. So he so despises Hanin Zoabi, one of these Palestinian members of the parliament, that for him, it's not enough that there's 12, 13 Palestinian members of parliament. To him, they're all Zoabis. Okay, every single one of them is a Zoabi, and that's how he calls them. He's like, I would never work, I would never have a government, I would never, cooperate with the Zoabis. This is the equivalent of a white congressman saying, I would never work with those Leroys, and talking about all African-American congressmen. It's a complete base racism, and yet it flies. It's barely mentioned. But no one bats an eyelash. Now, these members of the Knesset, they want to engage in parliamentary activity, of course, and when you have diplomats coming from other countries, they're also interested in hearing their opinions, but no, they can't meet with them in the Knesset because the Speaker of the Knesset, Yuli Edelstein, he refuses to allow them to do so. He says, only if there's a representative of the government sitting in on your meetings. So patronizing. We can't allow you to meet on your own. You're not legitimate enough to conduct political activity on your own. Only if one of us is a government representative is spying on your meeting. Of course, we have Stav Shafir, the so-called social justice leader, or so she'd like to think of herself. Apparently, she doesn't even say hello. She doesn't even acknowledge the Palestinian members of the Knesset. She just looks right through them as if they're air, as if they're not even there. Apparently, even the most far-right members of the Knesset will, at the very least, nod. But to them, she's so afraid of anyone seeing her talking to a Palestinian member of the Knesset, so that no one associates her with them, that she just refuses outright to acknowledge their existence. This is the so-called center-left in Israel. Of course, when we move to the government representatives, it's all out. So Deputy Interior Minister Yaron Mazuz, right in the Knesset proceedings themselves, he just tells the Palestinian members of the Knesset, he says, return your identity card. We are doing you people a favor by even allowing you to be seated here. Of course, when we go all the way to the right with the Israel Beitenu party, the head of the party, Avigdor Lieberman, the foreign minister of Israel until just recently, he just comes out and says, the heads of the Nazi regime were executed. I hope this will be the fate of Palestinian members of the Knesset. So this is where we're at. This is the discourse. This is how Palestinian people, non-Jewish people, are boycotted by the state of Israel in housing, in labor, in recreational facilities, and in political representation. Now, notice I have not said a word about the Nakba. I have not said a word about the Naksa. I have not said a word about the West Bank. I have not said a word at all about Gaza. I haven't said anything about all the buildings destroyed. I haven't said anything about 550 kids killed last summer, right? And the reason why is because although I don't agree with this formulation, there's this liberal Zionist idea. When we talk about boycotts, liberal Zionists say, don't boycott the state of Israel. It's not fair to do so. How can you possibly blame the state of Israel for the settlements that created them? Of course, it's one big system. It's the same government. It's the same army. It's the same banking system. It's one system. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we accept this liberal Zionist idea that these are two separate entities. There's democratic Israel and non-democratic Israel. There's the settlements that's non-democratic, and then there's democratic Israel, the rest pre-67 Israel. Well, if we accept that formulation, everything I've shown you so far is just so-called democratic Israel, okay? And how that so-called democratic Israel boycotts non-Jews. And I argue that it's not a democracy, that it's an ethnocracy, where rights and privileges are doled out not on the basis of citizenship, but on the basis of your ethnicity. So that's bad enough. But what we see now is that more and more there are movements that want to alter that ethnocracy and transform it into a theocracy. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about the goals of these theocracists, of goals and strategies and tactics of these Jewish dominionist groups who want to turn the state of Israel into a full-on theocracy. Now, the goal is a theocracy. The strategy is a race war that they want to pop off, and the tactics are arson. We're talking about burning fields and burning trees and burning cars and burning Palestinian mosques and burning Palestinian churches. And just so you don't think this is like just, some kids who are got to get their stress out and, they're wilding out on the weekend or something. They leave graffiti at the scene of the crime so you know what their intentions were. And so we see graffiti of Jesus is a monkey, chop down the idols. Keep in mind, Christians are only 1% to 2% of the entire population. And even so, to these Jewish dominionists, they are seen as a lethal threat, that must be excised. And so we're not just talking about mosques and churches, but even schools, if you can imagine this. And here it's important to point out that almost all schools in Israel are segregated. There's never been a Brown versus Board of Education moment in Israel's history, okay? And so there's maybe 5, 6, 7 desegregated schools in the country where Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel study together. This is one of those few schools, the only one in the Jerusalem area. And we had Jewish dominionists go in at night and torch grade 1 classroom, if you can imagine that. And it's not just burning mosques and churches and schools, but now you even have burning families, whole families alive. And 3 months ago, Jewish dominionists went to the village of Duma outside of Nablus, and they firebombed the home, and they murdered the father, mother, and 1-year-old baby. What's worse, because, quite clearly, every society is going to have its psychos, and there's always going to be evil people who, are going to commit horrific acts of violence. The question is, how does the government respond to these acts of violence? And what we see is, again, don't take it from me, but we'll listen for a minute to Yuval Diskin, who is formerly the head of the Shin Bet, the Shabak, Israel's FBI, essentially. And what he says about Israel's response to these attacks, he says, now and forever, there's been a total lack of will to tackle this issue at the political level, talking about Jewish dominionist attacks, terrorist attacks on Palestinian people. No will by politicians to bring these people to justice, the most minimum of justice. And admittedly, the perpetrators, the torturers of that desegregated school in Jerusalem, they were caught. I guess they found some DNA evidence at the scene, and it wasn't so difficult. They had posted on the internet, we hope a Holocaust happens to you Arabs, so it wasn't so difficult to track them down. In any case, they were brought before the court, and they were sentenced to just 2 years, and as they were led out, they were singing praises to Yahweh, and they told the media it was worth it. But bad enough that there's young people who are educated to this. What's worse is that it isn't just outliers, that sadly increasing numbers of Jewish youth are expressing at least, if not similar sentiments, at least willing to overlook these sentiments spoken by others. So 28%, a mere 28% of Jewish Israeli youth responding to a poll said that they outright condemn these racist hate attacks on Palestinians. So 72% of Jewish Israeli high school students are not willing to outright condemn these racist hate attacks that I just went through. Of course, don't get the impression that that means everyone. There are people in Jewish Israeli society who are horrified and who are sickened and disgusted by these disgusting racist acts. For example, this man, a mayor of a town in northern Israel, once this happened, and the Dawabsheh family, the mother, father, and one-year-old baby, once they were murdered, he went onto Facebook the next day and he wrote to his constituents, he said, "Around us, we are seeing more and more displays of hatred and violence that make us all cringe. This is the time to remember the most important commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself. Let's stop hating. And as it says in the book of Psalms, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it." I appreciate that he had the courage to come out and say something, especially because it shouldn't be taken for granted. The very next day after this happened, within 24 hours, his car was torched in front of his house. So let's just say it's a very strong disincentive to come out and speak out against racist violence in Israel. Now, once again, just as in the other cases, the perpetrators left graffiti at the scene of the crime. So we know what motivated them, and they wrote, "Long live the King, the Messiah." Well, that's not something that they made up. Okay, this is a phrase that has a long history that they've tapped into, and specifically, this is the motto of the Chabad movement. Okay, this is a group that some of you may be familiar with because they are active here in the United States, in New York City, Brooklyn, perhaps here on campus. I'm not familiar with what's happening here, but this is their motto, Yechi Melech HaMashiach, and you'll see this plastered around all over Israel. Now, brother, by the way, I would ask if you would put that down, because if you want to film, you'd have to ask me beforehand, so just now at the last moment. But all this is going to be online afterwards, and you will have ample opportunity to see the original tape. But thanks. As you can see, there's all kinds of recording devices here. In any case, going back to the talk, Yechi Melech HaMashiach. This is the motto of the Chabad movement, and it's been scrawled at the scene of the crime of the burning of the Dawabsheh family. Now, this group, Chabad, we see that they have amassed no small amount of political power. They've been meeting with American presidents since Reagan, at least. George Bush Sr., Clinton, George Bush Jr., Obama, meeting in the Oval Office. So this is a sign of how much of power that they've amassed. Let's look at the leaders of the group and their their foundational texts, Hatanya, which is their the religious manifesto, and the writings of their spiritual leader, Menachem Schneerson, who's since passed on, but he's revered as a messianic figure. This is what they have to say about non-Jewish people. The souls of the nations of the world emanate from unclean spheres which contain no good whatsoever. The Jewish body looks as if it were, in substance, similar to bodies of non-Jews. But the difference is so great that the body should be considered as completely different species. Now, I'm no biologist, but I'm pretty sure I'm not of the species Homo sapiens judaicus or something like that. I'm pretty sure we share the same DNA here, but according to Chabad, apparently we don't. Of course, that's on this physical level. On the spiritual level, they write, an even greater difference exists in regards to the soul. Two contrary types of soul exist. A non-Jewish soul comes from 3 satanic spheres, while a Jewish soul stems from holiness. Not easy words to read. Again, it's not only in the United States. In Israel, this group has also amassed no small amount of power. When Netanyahu meets with them, he'll also don a skull cap with the same motto inscribed on it. But he isn't their favorite Israeli legislator. They actually much prefer the member of Knesset that challenged Netanyahu from the right for the leadership of the Likud party, Moshe Feiglin, who last summer, as deputy speaker of the Knesset, while the massacres were going on in Gaza, he writes, the IDF, the Israeli army, shall designate certain open areas in which the civilian population will be concentrated, he writes. And subsequent to the elimination, Gaza will become part of Israel and will be populated by Jews. So outright calls for ethnic cleansing. He's their favorite member of Knesset, and they bring him around the world, from Canada, Australia, they fly him across the globe to speak to their synagogues and their community centers. This most reflects their vision that they want to see implemented in Israel. But you don't need to go to the political level. They have their own rabbinical representatives in Israel. And the top Chabad Rabbi Yitzchak Ginsburg has been very active on the ground. He's infamous, among other things, for giving the asmachta, or the seal of the religious seal of approval, to the book Torat HaMelech, the King's Torah. I don't know if you've heard of this book before, but it bears mentioning a couple words about it. Sickeningly, this is something of a Gentile murdering manual. It's like a theological treatise that a rabbi wrote, a state-funded rabbi, I might add, wrote a few years back. He wrote, under what circumstances may a Jew murder or kill a non-Jew? And he comes to the conclusion in the book that under pretty much any circumstance, he writes in the book, there is justification for killing babies if it is clear that they will grow up to harm us. This is sick stuff. And it's this top Chabad rabbi, Yitzchak Ginsburg, that gives it the religious seal of approval. Yes, this is authoritative, this complies with all the rules of halakha, of Jewish religious law. So this is Chabad in practice. Now, again, this isn't all factions, all streams of Judaism by any stretch of the imagination. While, yes, the perpetrators of that sick act inscribed the motto of Chabad, but there was a surviving member of the family, 9-year-old Ahmed. At first, no one knew if he was going to survive. He burned all over his body, but gradually he has actually, he's on the road to recovery, let's just say. And while he was still in the hospital, but we weren't quite sure what was going to happen, this man, a rabbi in Israel, Gilad Kariv, the head of the Reform movement in Israel, he organized a prayer, an inter-religious, interfaith prayer session, okay, in which he invited Muslim imams and Christian priests and himself, Jewish rabbi, and they held a prayer session in order to pray for the speedy recovery of 9-year-old Ahmed Dawabshe. And we had some really interesting remarks to make at this talk. So at the prayer session for Ahmed Dawabshe, he says, those doing price tag attacks are doing, the price tag attacks, I should point out, that's the term for, that's the laundered term for racial hate attacks on Palestinian people. Okay, so those doing price tag attacks are doing real Jewish acts, just as we are doing Jewish acts here. Okay? Here, meaning doing this prayer session for Ahmed Dawabsheh. In the Jewish writings, you can find humanistic writings next to dark ideas, and the two are the two faces of Judaism. Until we understand this, we won't be able to fight for the leading voice of Judaism. It's not that those who carry out hate crimes are a distortion of Judaism and that we are the true Judaism. No, it is a struggle between two options of Judaism. Now, I've until now been talking about one of these Jewish dominionist groups, the Chabad movement. I'm now going to move on to speak about another Jewish dominionist group, the Jewish Home Party. This is one of the political parties in the Knesset and, in fact, in the Israeli government. Now, we're going to look at some of their famous quotes, and we're going to look at some of their political activities. So Ynnon Magal, of course, he's come out and said, the Arab nation, all it brings to the world is murder and blood. And now he's spearheading an effort to fight, in his words, for the rights of Jews to pray on the Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque sits. This is pretty much the last place in Palestine where Muslims have any sort of sovereignty. It's considered the third holiest site in Islam. And so, but he believes that Jewish people should also have rights there. And so he says he's going to fight for it. But he doesn't want you to think that he means that it needs to be demolished and bulldozed and destroyed, the way some people say. Well, Ynnon Magal, you would have had an easier time convincing me that you don't intend for it to be destroyed if, in fact, when you uploaded that message to the internet, you didn't include a selfie of yourself posing with this man who actually sat in jail for years for plotting to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But we see that this is a phenomenon, that Jewish Home Party lawmakers bring terrorists, convicted terrorists, into the parliament as their advisors. So we see Ayelet Shaked, she just named Woman of the Year by a leading Israeli magazine, and of course, famous quote from her last summer, "Who is the enemy? The Palestinian people are all enemy combatants. This also includes the mothers." There's no such thing as a Palestinian civilian, total genocide. And again, I see her in photographs once she comes to power, meeting with this bearded man, and I also see the leader of the Jewish Home Party, Naftali Bennett, who, of course, we've heard him say, "I've killed many Arabs in my life, and there's no problem with it." So both Shaked and Bennett, I see them meeting with this bearded man, and I noticed on the campaign trail that there were lots of photographs of them together. They kept, meeting, and even here in the halls of the Knesset itself, and did a little bit of digging, and it turns out this man is Natan Natanzon, and once again, convicted terrorist, sat in jail for being part of a plot that actually attempted to assassinate several Palestinian mayors. And in fact, were partially successful. They blew off this guy's legs. He was the mayor of Nablus, and they actually bombed him and, took both of his legs off. So these are the terrorists that have become the advisors, the political advisors of the Jewish Home political party. This is the ideology that's being brought into the government. So we've talked about the Chabad movement, we've talked about the Jewish Home Party, and now we're going to talk a little bit about Lehava. Lehava, or the followers of Kahana. Now, just as the Jewish Home Party brings in terrorists and Jewish dominionists into the halls of government, we also have the ruling Likud party doing the same thing. So Lehava was brought into the Knesset to be expert witnesses, by Israel's top two diplomats. This is Tzipi Chodoveli, she's the acting foreign minister. This is Dani Danon, Israel's ambassador to the UN. So the country's top two diplomats. Chodoveli was the one who invited Lehava to the Knesset. Danon was the one who hosted them. And they came to the Knesset and gave testimony on how there's this plague of miscegenation taking over the country. I don't expect everyone in the room to understand what miscegenation means. Again, it's a laundered term for so-called race mixing, okay? For racists who believe there's such a thing as races, then they don't want races to mix, and so they come up with, they don't want to sound as racist as they sound, so they come up with a made-up scientific-sounding word, miscegenation. So this is the anti-miscegenation movement. And we see how they put their ideology into practice in Israel. This is Moral. She's the daughter of Jewish citizens of Israel. This is Mahmoud, the son of Muslim citizens of Israel. Notice how I said the daughter of, the son of. I didn't say she's Jewish or he's Muslim. Because in Israel, no one gives you a test to ask you ideological or theological questions. Do you pray to Allah or do you worship Yahweh? It's not determined by any religious test. It's all racially determined. Okay? If your parents were registered as such and such, or their parents were registered, that's how we determine what religion you are. In any case, this isn't allowed. Miscegenation can't exist. There's no legal way for a Jew and a non-Jew to marry in Israel. Okay? And that's not by accident. That's very much on purpose. Much of the Orthodox Jewish rules that were the hallmark of Jewish communal life in villages in Eastern Europe and other parts of the world were cast aside because the Zionist movement was ostensibly a secular movement. But this was one of the aspects of Orthodox Judaism that they did preserve, that they held on to, this racial separation. And so there's no way to marry in Israel Jews and non-Jews. Of course, if you're rich enough, you can fly to New York City, you can go down to City Hall and get married there, come back to the country, and it's a fait accompli. Okay, nothing to do about it, but in Israel you can't do it. Still, despite all odds, it's extremely rare, but some, Romeo, Juliet romances, some people meet and fall in love and decide they want to spend their lives together. That was the case with this couple, met in Jaffa and decided they wanted to spend, but at their wedding, or wedding party, where we were both there together, actually. We have hundreds of Jewish Israelis screaming, "Mavet la'Aravim," death to the Arabs. It's frightening. It's chilling. It's pretty traumatic, actually, to witness some of this stuff. And this is just the beginning. And so it also bears saying that these groups get support from the Israeli government. We don't have numbers for the last couple of years, but just a couple of years ago, we have $166,000 annually, this group, Lehava, receiving from the Israeli government through their sister organization, and even here in the United States, okay? $234,000 last year from the US, gathered by charities operating here in America, and because they're tax-exempt charities, that means that y'all are subsidizing these funds. They're coming to Israel to pay for what? Well, remember I showed you before those Jewish dominionists who firebombed and who torched that joint school, Jewish-Arab school in Jerusalem, and they got convicted for, well, who paid for we all paid for their legal fees, okay? It is this $234,000 that was sent to Israel in order to fight the legal battles of these Jewish supremacist terrorists. Now, at this point, with all the torchings and burnings and the arsons going on, it kind of begs the question, at least some enterprising journalist is going to straight up ask the head of Lehava, do you support this? And he was asked, are you in favor of burning churches in the land of Israel? Yes or no, straight up. And what he said, no beating around the bush, just, you have to burn. Yes, of course. Simply yes. Why are you even asking? You have any doubt? Now, I assume this wasn't published in the New York Post. Didn't make it. I mean, this is the thing. Why do I have to come all the way here from Israel to tell you this? I wasted all these fossil fuels to get here, and there are bureaus working in Israel that presumably it's their task and it's their duty to inform you of these things. It's pretty ridiculous that the mainstream media is failing miserably at its job. And so Lehava, as I said, they are followers of Kahana, Meir Kahana specifically. This is an American Israeli rabbi. Kahana was right. This is their slogan. You see this graffitied all over the country. Now, Kahana actually was once a member of the Knesset in Israel in the 1980s. Actually, he used the same shtick. He'd hold up a noose on the dais in the Knesset. Now, the difference is between then and now. What's changed? You see, then when Kahana made his views known and tried to enact legislation that reflected his twisted warped racist ideology. At that time, those views were considered beyond the pale. And so you have even a member of the ruling Likud party, Michael Eitan, standing up in the Knesset itself on the dais and calling him out to his face and saying, "You, Kahana, are no different than Hitler." Shocking words, but this was said in the Knesset itself. And he broke it down, and he went point by point, comparison, and he said, "Kahana, you want to cancel the Camp David peace treaty, Hitler canceled the Versailles peace treaty. You want to make the Communist Party illegal in Israel, Hitler made the Communist Party illegal in Nazi Germany. You want to make it illegal to sell non-kosher food, Hitler made it illegal to sell kosher food. You want to make it so that non-Jews can't live in Jerusalem, Hitler did the same thing for Berlin and Munich. You want to make it so that non-Jews can't vote or hold public office, Hitler did the same thing for Jews in Germany. You want to make it so that non-Jews can't go to school with Jews, and Hitler did the same thing. You want to make it so Jews and non-Jews can't swim in public pools together. Again, straight off the books of Nazi Germany. And of course, the classic, you want to make it so that Jews and non-Jews can't marry or even make love. And again, straight out of the Nazi playbook. Now, he's no longer with us. Kahana was assassinated right here in New York City about 20 years ago. And so but even though he no longer lives, his legacy lives on. He's been iconified, and his image is now being adopted by young generation of racists who praise him and aspire to be like him and put his ideology into practice. And the difference today is that instead of his ideas being beyond the pale for the ruling Likud party, we see that people who espouse these views are actually embraced by the ruling Likud party. So you have Miri Regev, the top female official of the Likud party, the Minister of Culture in the government, posing, taking selfies with someone wearing Kahanist clothing. As I said, Kahana himself is long gone, but his grandson lives, and he himself is one of the leading ideologues of these Jewish dominionists. He's advocating for attacking Palestinian people publicly, but in truth, a few years ago, he was actually, when he was just working his way up to that level of racist hate, he was active on another level. At this time, some settlers are just incensed that settlement construction doesn't occur quick enough, even though expanding and gobbling up more land from Palestinian people. But for some settlers, it's not happening quick enough, and they resent that the Israeli army holds them back, doesn't allow them to progress full speed ahead. So at this time, several years ago, we have this man, Kahana's grandson, and others actually attacking Israeli army vehicles, if you can imagine this, like puncturing their tires, throwing rocks at them, and as their way of saying boo-hoo to the state for not allowing us to build, unimpeded. And so they couldn't have done it, though, without some help. And in fact, the way that they were able to evade capture while the army was trying to hunt them down, it's like this cat and mouse game. And we know that they were able to evade capture because they were getting text messages from someone saying, well, the army's coming from here, so you better move around in this direction. And the person who was giving them these directions was none other than this man. And the way he knew where the army was coming from, because he's Ze'ev Elkin, he's a minister in the government. At that time, a top lawmaker in the ruling Likud party, actually the whip of the ruling Likud party and the whip of the coalition government. So I imagine that in most other countries in the world, if you are a government minister and you are giving known criminals information about how to evade security officers, I imagine that's considered to be treason, but apparently in Israel it's a reason for promotion. And if there was any doubt about the state's response to these kinds of actions and how cops and clan work hand in hand in Israel, we see that just a few weeks ago, Moshe Alon, the defense minister of Israel, he admits openly that the government knows who burned the Dawabshe family. He knows who murdered them. But the state refuses to bring them to justice. He says, Israel knows who is responsible, but has chosen to prevent legal recourse to protect the identity of their sources. So they know who did it because they have spies working with the terrorists, but if we bring them to trial, then we have to have these spies or inside undercover agents testify, and then they won't be able to be undercover agents anymore. Their cover will be blown. So we want them to keep spying and working hand in hand with the terrorists. So I don't know what they're waiting for. Like, what's worse than burning a baby? But apparently Palestinian lives matter so little that that's not enough of a reason to bring these people to trial. And this is the situation we have in Israel today. This is Israel 2015.